This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. A quick announcement before we get to this episode. S4 24 tickets, S4 happens March 4th through 7th in 2024. Those tickets go on sale on October 2nd at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. And we keep the ticket one pricing at that price for 36 hours. So the ticket one pricing is $15.95 US dollars plus tax, and it's for tickets number 1 to 100. We typically sell about 250 to 300 tickets in that first 24 hours. So we want to be fair to everyone across all time zones. So for 36 hours from 12:01 a.m. on October 2nd to noontime on October 3rd, Eastern Daylight Time, that ticket one price will be available. So you don't have to wake up early. You don't have to wait in line. Just do it sometime in those first 36 hours, and you can get your ticket. Two other things that are new this year. Since we had a sellout last year, and we typically get about a 30% increase in the number of attendees. So we had to turn away about 100 this year. We're probably going to have to turn away, 400 in 2024. So we wanted to meet a need that we were hearing across the board. We were hearing from asset owners. We want more asset owners at the event. We were hearing from vendors. We want more asset owners at the event. We are hearing the same thing from the government. So the only way we can get more asset owners at the event in a sold out event is limit the number of tickets any non-asset owner entity can get. Now, this is primarily vendors, but it could be government as well. So based on your company size, you will be limited to 5, 10, or 15 tickets. Again, with the sole goal of increasing the asset owner percentage at the event. What this means to you practically is when you buy your ticket on October 2nd to get that good price, you will go into an approval list. And then within 24 hours, we will check it off. If your organization has not met its ticket limits, then you will get your ticket approved and you'll get the receipt and everything else, just like in past years. So a little extra hitch. We're going to see how it works this year. But again, the sole goal of adding this is to increase the asset owner percentage at the event. Now, this does not say we don't value consultants, vendors, and others coming to the event. They're a large part of creating the future. It's just we would like to increase the mix over about the 30% that we typically see asset owner attendance to be to about 50%. The other trick that you need to be aware of here, or let's say change, trick might not be a great word, but the other change is that the Lowe's Miami South Beach Hotel, where the event is held, was very popular. And our $299 plus tax rate is amazing. We're paying that partially down. We're paying down $136 of that to get you to the $299. And if you go online right now, you'd see a price of about $750 a night. We have a room block of just over 350 rooms, and we want to make sure that the people that have a ticket get the rooms, not just some company comes in and buys 20 rooms, which, quite frankly, happened last year. So what we're going to do is when you buy your ticket, you're going to get a link that will allow you to reserve your room at the Lowe's. Now, we're not under any illusion that that link is going to remain private. So what we're doing is we will be checking every week that the attendees that have rooms at the Lowe's actually have a ticket. And if you don't, you will lose your room at the Lowe's. So, in summary, if you know you're coming to S4, you should buy your ticket on October 2nd or 3rd. If you know that you want to stay at the Lowe's, you should reserve your room right away because that hotel exceeded everyone's expectations last year, and I have no doubt that those rooms are going to go very fast. Now, if you don't get one of those rooms, it's not a big deal. There's about 20 hotels within a couple of blocks in all different price ranges. So you'll get a hotel, but if you want to stay at the Lowe's, you're going to have to move fast. This episode is a replay of a webinar I did with the Sunspec Alliance. The Sunspec Alliance mission is to accelerate the growth of distributed energy industry and expand the market for renewable power by specifying de facto standards that enable solar PV and energy storage distributed energy power plants. It was a great webinar. I really enjoyed the questions they asked. We got into some areas we don't usually talk about. I tried to be as frank and opinionated and analytical as I usually am, so I think you'll enjoy that. But I do appreciate the Sunspec Alliance giving me permission to replay this webinar. You can learn more about Sunspec at sunspec.org. That's sunspec.org.
Welcome, Dale. It's awesome to have you on our webinar series. So for those that don't know, I participated in one of Dale's unsolicited response podcasts about some wind cybersecurity work that Sandia and INL did, and we went deep in the metrics. So it's cool to flip the script here a little bit, and I get to be on this side of the question and answer session. So what I wanted to do is hopefully get the conversation started with a few preliminary questions, and then I'm hoping those in the solar industry have other questions, and we can get it in the chat and start peppering Dale with all the difficult things we've been facing over the last 5 or 10 years in DER cybersecurity. So let's I'll start it off with just kind of a broad topic here. We have a challenge in the DER community in that, at least at the residential level, solar installations, well, solar inverters, battery storage systems, and others are built very similar to IoT devices, where there are multiple stakeholders requesting access to these devices, meaning the homeowner wants to pull up on their iPhone or smartphone their solar production. The utility wants to communicate to the devices to provide grid services. The vendors need to communicate to the devices to provide firmware updates and things of that nature. In many cases, they pull back telemetry and provide that to the end customer. So since you have a lot broader perspective on the different, I guess, ICS OT communities in general, do you see similar access control challenges out there where you have such a broad collection of stakeholders that don't always have the depth of cybersecurity knowledge as others? Meaning, you know, traditional power plants or water facilities or wastewater facilities, most of the people communicating with the ICS devices are at least familiar with the cybersecurity and communication protocols, but here we have a lot of other stakeholders. So any thoughts on that?
Yep, and I assume you're hearing me. Is that right, Jay?
Yep, we got you.
Good. And thanks for having me on the show. It's always more challenging to be on this side of the interview than on the side you're at. I'm used to asking the questions and driving the conversation. But it's a pleasure to be here. And by the way, I have a solar system. I live in Hawaii, so electricity costs 42 cents per kilowatt. We save about $100 a week with our solar system, and we don't even have heat or air conditioning, so it's a big thing, as well as providing us, you know, the backup when there are outages like we've been experiencing on Maui with the fires this week. That's a good question you have there. And the OT world is much simpler in general. So if you look, for example, at a power plant, they might be using GE's Mark 6E turbine control system. And that actually has some security in it like you would want. And you can deploy a certificate architecture to protect that. But in that case, the asset owner would just create their CA. There'd be one certificate authority, one certificate. You don't have this multi-tenant, multi-user type problem. They are starting to see this a little bit in some of the services that people are offering. So if you take that GE example, GE may want to monitor and control a boiler or something like that. and that would be a different thing. Unfortunately, a lot of them are just punting on that challenge. They're saying, this is a trusted partner. It's a yes or no decision, and just give me VPN access in, and I'll trust that you'll only do the right things, which of course is not what any security person would represent. On your side, on the DER side, with all the different stakeholders and participants that you mentioned, it is a harder problem. And I almost wonder if it's not going to be a business solution rather than a technical solution. I wonder if enforcing that level of control down at each individual home or business or device is something that's just going to become impractical, and whether there will be some business that will sit in front and they will have the trusted connection to those end devices. Let's say, here I am in Maui, so Maui Electric would have a trusted partner, or Maui Electric might choose to do it for themselves, and they would control who can get to what access on the other end of that. I could see that business model taking place. I have a little harder time seeing us actually solve the problem at all these end devices to deal with all the cases that you mentioned. It's not technically impossible, just very difficult to get all those people to agree.
Well, yeah, maybe a little more technical level. We also see a challenge where a lot of people access these devices locally, and so they're not going through that cloud gateway or something like that to get into the system, where you'd have a federated, Active Directory or something like that managing access control.
Yeah, but does that really matter as much, Jay?
Does the device communicate up?
Well, Jay, I think that doesn't matter as much, because we're dealing with that in OT as well. So if you have physical access to a power plant, to a substation, to a pumping plant, to a manufacturing floor, you can do a lot of bad things. There is a certain level of physical security that's expected, and if you can get there, I don't think we have the same threat profile as someone being able to do it to thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of devices over the internet from anywhere. So I think if we try to make those comparative levels of, quote, cybersecurity for local access and physical access, and provide that same level of flexibility, we're probably not going to succeed either.
Yeah.
Well, look at it. I have a question I want to drop in here. So, which is that, Dale, I think this problem is compounded by this distributed ownership model, right? So, in your case, Maui Electric doesn't own your system, you do, and at least in the mainland, you would have the opportunity to participate in other programs, perhaps wholesale programs, et cetera, or you of course are going to also exert your own preferences. In the event of a grid emergency, if you have a certain type of system, well, you may prioritize keeping your own lights on and your own refrigerator on. So we also have this sort of overlapping controls, in not only overlapping points of ingress, but also overlapping controls. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's obviously a hard problem. That's why your group exists, right? To try to solve this problem. If it was easy, it wouldn't work. But I think that the utilities are going to have a lot of control over what you can and can't do. I mean, I had to go through a large paperwork process, or the person that connected me up to the grid. Now, if I'm running my own standalone system, that's different, right? If I'm off grid. But as soon as I say I want to connect to the grid can start to require some things of me. And one of those could be, where any services you want need to go through us, and they need to be approved services and such. And I almost, when you start to look at regulation or compliance requirements, I almost wonder if the solution isn't going to be the governments, but it's going to be the utilities. You just came up with this Sunspec device spec that was mentioned, that Tom mentioned at the beginning, Jay. My utility could say, you can't deploy one of these things unless it's Sunspec certified, in theory.
That's right. And actually, this rolls into my next question, which is great. And that is, what's the role of government here? So there's been a lot of talk about potentially NERC SIP requirements being applied to smaller devices. There's been a lot of talk at the White House level about distribution system and grid edge devices having new cybersecurity requirements. But to date, we haven't seen any sort of regulatory action, at least at the federal level. There's been some conversations at the state level, but I agree that the utilities may be the best place if we could come up with a standardized or harmonized set of requirements that they apply it. So I was wondering if you could go through maybe the federal level, the state level, and a jurisdictional level. What are the pros and cons there? And I was, recently you were talking about the Patch Act on your podcast. And so I'm curious if the medical device field could be a good exemplar for the DER space, where we could come up with like a Patch Act for DER devices. And you'd have a set of simple requirements for not medical devices in this case, but any DER equipment.
Wow, that is a big, meaty set of questions there. So I'm gonna answer part of it, and then maybe stop and see if you want to go into it, and then we'll hit the Patch Act later. Okay.
Okay. You're a professional interviewer. You got to cut me some slack.
No, I do that to my people sometimes. I ask them 3 tough questions, and because it just comes to your mind. I know the issue. I did write an article that said, if I were king, what would I do? Or if I were omnipotent, what regulation I would have? And I'm much more a fan of regulating a capability and then allowing the various sectors and asset owners to decide how they will meet that capability. For example, you need to be able to, if we're thinking about, let's say, Colonial Pipeline, you need to be able to restore pipeline operations within 3 days after a cyber incident. Don't tell me how to stop it or anything, but as a country, outages happen for weather and all sorts of reasons. What's most important is that we don't have long-term sustained outages. So I'm not a big fan of this government creating this long list of requirements. It is ever growing and unproven to be effective. Now, I quite frankly, I'm losing that battle. I don't expect to win that battle. When I think about the regulation, though, it almost splits into 2 sides. It's the concern for society, for the nation, and then there's concern for the consumer. And from the nation standpoint, I think the biggest concern is all this new solar and wind and other distributed energy. Whatever it happens to that system, it doesn't have an impact on our traditional generation and transmission and distribution system. So you see a lot of stunt hacking now. They say, well, hack all these things and that'll cause the grid to collapse. Okay, I know this is more of an engineering problem than a security problem to figure out how various changes in loads and such could affect the grid. I think that's the most important thing that the government should be focused on, and engineers play a large role. And then the cybersecurity people generally help by saying to the engineers, how are you stopping this from happening? And then seeing if that way that they're stopping it could be hacked. Just a real simple example is a lot of systems will have what's called soft interlocks in PLCs, where the PLC will say, if this and this and this happens, shut this down. But if you can if the engineer has to realize you can reprogram that PLC if the attacker is in the network. So that's where the cybersecurity people play a role in helping the engineers understand what's possible. But I think that's the thing that's most interesting from a national security standpoint. And just on the consumer standpoint, that's more what I see Sunspec and others doing, is I bought a system, a business bought a system. We expect it to work to a certain level of capability and survive a certain level of threat and attack. And so it's almost more the consumer protection or business protection aspect of regulation, but I would separate that from the national security. And I'll stop there before we dive into patch. Any thoughts or follow-ups on that, or should I jump into patch?
Well, so I think the industry poll is an interesting question. I'm not sure. So this maybe brings up a whole nother thing, which is the White House and FCC's new cyber labeling program. And I understand that the approach here is to provide the consumers information for which hopefully will guide them in the choice of purchasing one system over another, because one will appear to be more secure than the other based on the information on the cyber label, or whatever they're calling it, something like that.
And that's more, that, Jay, I think falls more in the consumer protection side, right? That's not affecting grid stability or things like that. It might play a small role, but that's not the primary purpose. It's so that people buy good things, that people don't buy bad things. And there's, there's something to that. I do wonder, though, that if that's not going to be more effectively, again, as I said before, enforced by the utility rather than by the owner.
Yeah, and then for the more, I guess, governmental perspective on engineering the power system to be resilient and withstand these attacks that are coming, we get a lot of benefit in the diversity of the equipment out there. So there are pools of DER devices that are connected back to cloud services that could potentially be compromised in a bulk setting. But in general, there's enough diversity there that you're not going to topple the power system, at least not yet. But that'll become more easy as more and more of these devices are deployed out there. And so I do appreciate your perspective on this, in that, I guess big government coming in and saying thou shalt do XYZ, and then the technology evolves and one of these elements is no longer relevant. Like, it has to be more of and cyber standards always struggle with this, right? Because cybersecurity is evolving so quickly, and by the time the standard is developed and pushed out there, there's some new technology that's either going to compromise it or make it better. And so what's written there may not be appropriate any longer.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the big government piece, Dale. Mm-hmm. People that buy solar, electric vehicles, energy storage, they tend to be have a libertarian bent, meaning government stay out of my face. I want to do my own thing. So I don't know. Have you faced this in other industries? Have you seen this in other industries? And yeah, if so, what can you offer any advice there? Because I mean, what we're trying to do as advocates for the solar industry is to get more of the stuff, deployed and in place and electrify society. And so these arguments about who can say who can do what cyber wise or whatever, what you can do with your own equipment, these are very much top of mind topics that could represent a big speed bump or impediment to deploying more.
Well, to directly answer your question, what some of the sectors have done, the chemistry or the chemical sector is a good example. The American Chemistry Council has been very proactive in saying we're creating our own. It's like a good housekeeping seal. I can't remember what it's called. Good care. Oh, I think it's responsible care. And what they have done is they've taken the approach. I don't think they would admit this in a congressional hearing, but they've taken the approach that if we look like we're responsible stewards of our sector, we're less likely to get prescriptive regulations pushed down on us. Now, it's a very different environment than when they started this 15 years ago. I'm not sure you're going to be able to avoid it, but that's their approach, is they have the same sort of thing. And I think a lot of times, the regulation is really hard, because anytime, and it's like security policies are hard. There's all these things that sound good and you can't say they're bad, but they might not move the needle at all in risk. I mean, they might be so infinitesimally of an improvement, but if you leave it off the list and something happens, they say, oh, you didn't do that. So that's where you get into this ugly thing with regulation. And in fact, with the documents you're trying to create, I took a look before this at your Sunspec device requirements, and I was actually quite impressed. I got to give the team that put that together some kudos. I have some issues with it, but like anything else, but the way you limited what was going to be in that spec to the things that were really important and were really going to make a difference, and avoided that temptation to just have the laundry list of every good practice. I think that is definitely the right approach.
Well, thank you. We're very deliberate in that, and we're going against the tide in this field, right? Because the natural inclination is to, I think, over specify, which just makes it much harder for the industry to reckon with, and then, you know, obviously to absorb.
Mm-hmm. So Dale, actually, this came up on our last meeting within that work group, and that is the topic of harmonizing more with IEC 6443, and I know you've got a lot of history with them and that certification. Do you think that is the correct approach? Is aligning the Sunspec certification to the IEC 6443, or do you think just having a bare bones set of requirements, a common sense set of requirements, is all that is needed, or at least for the kind of phase one level of this?
I think the latter. I don't think you want to harmonize with that now. And when you think about how those specifications, the environments they were designed for, now they are basic security principles, so you could say they could apply everywhere, and they have some documents saying this is how it applies to IoT. But yeah, I much prefer your approach of saying these are the basic things you should do. The tricky part, and if you can avoid, I guess, one of my critiques of the early ISA certifications as you start to move to Sunspec certifications, is that when you see a stamp on something, like early on, you'd see ISA Secure Level 1 certified, and yet that Level 1 cert didn't require any authentication of communications. You know, so it almost sends this false message. It says, hey, this thing is secure, but, you know, if you read the details, they didn't hide it, but if you go down in the details, you say, no, it's really not that secure. They just did some fuzzing of the protocol stack. And I think that's one of the challenges with the certifications, is to give the customers the correct impression of the security that's provided. And which is a challenge when you pick a small set of security requirements, right? You're not going to be able to say it does everything. So I'm not sure how you solve that problem, but I see that as one of the challenges.
Yeah. If we look at some of the most recent CVEs for this community, I don't think the Sunspec requirements are necessarily going to stop any of these remote code execution, web vulnerabilities, or web exploits, but at least it starts to point to, you need to have logging, and you need to be able to figure out what happened when things go wrong. So it's basic stuff, but I'm hoping it's certainly a step in the right direction. It's just, how big a step do you want to take? And
maybe we could qualify it as foundation part 1 of 10.
Yeah, you know, but see, nobody really reads that. That was probably, you know, ISA had level 2, level 3 certifications that were obviously more stringent, but people saw that ISA secure stamp on there. So that's the challenge. And I would say,
right,
that one of the only real issue I had with the device specification was the flexibility provided in the authentication. It said that the authentication had to do these things, but I could think of very insecure ways to meet that authentication requirement. And, you know, I almost wonder if you are certifying, if you could raise the bar on that. You give an example, the digital signature was a great example,
sure,
of a good way of doing it, but the way it was written, I could comply with it and do some very bad things. And I've seen a lot of bad crypto algorithms, protocols, implementations in my life that were proprietary, and I'd worry a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act, because I mean, the way that Sunspec quite often does its work is, especially in cybersecurity, is to not be prescriptive, right? We want to properly define the problem that we're trying to solve, and sort of lead the audience in the right direction, but without saying, thou shalt use, procedure XYZ, which may be popular in some places and not others, and suits some use cases and not others. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's my standards background. I'm not a standards guy. It requires too much patience and cooperation. It's not my strong suits. But I did banking standards, retail banking standards back in the late 80s for electronic funds transfer, the things that went in stores that you put your credit cards in, and ATM machines. Mm-hmm. And those were not regulatory standards, but if you wanted to be part of the Visa MasterCard system, you had to follow. And I think they had 4 options of ways you could do key management. And I just wonder if that's not the model where the utilities might say, okay, that's fine, the Sunspec standard, you meet it, but by the way, we're requiring you to do it this way, or something like that, where you get the people that can impact a lot of connections of these systems to the grid and other power resources. If you can get them to play ball, maybe from a business standpoint, that's how it moves forward.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah, I think the other question on this certification, I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but is around authorized test labs or nationally recognized test labs. And so I know that IEC 62443 is having a -6 something that will have a exact protocol on step-by-step how you do the certification. Do you think companies attesting to their security is sufficient, or do you think in-lab third-party assessments are necessary? And do you think that if you do third-party assessments, you need a explicit set of certification steps in which to get the criteria checked off? I think
it's a hard one. And we see the opposite model with some of the cloud certifications, right? There's a fair amount that you can self-certify, and then as you get more complex. To me, when I looked at the Sunspec device certification or device requirements and the certification document, to me that seemed like one that self-certification seemed feasible, because it wasn't that complex to do it, and there was a step, and you could probably have some requirements for data, a data package that proved you did it. Obviously you get more rigor with the whole program. I don't know which one's right or wrong, but I would say that the current specification is simple enough that I would think self-certification would work. As you start to get more complex, then, and you're actually testing, because a lot of it was the specification. If I would describe it as having certain capabilities rather than robustly testing those capabilities. Are you encrypting it? Can you upload corrupted firmware? Are you getting these log messages when you do these things? To me, that's something that setting up the whole certification infrastructure, while it might give you more confidence, might not be worth the effort. But I don't feel strongly about either one of those, but I think you could go self-certification if you wanted to.
So we've had a couple of questions come in here about the IEEE 1547.3 standard, and Dale, I don't expect you to know what that means, but so I'll tell you what it means. This is a guide, recommended practices guide, and the IEEE 1547 standard proper 1547-2018. This is the U.S. Regulated standard for how all distributed energy resources interconnect And this .3 thing is a guide that says that here are the recommended practices about how to go about securing your site or your system. And so it's not a standard, so therefore it doesn't have testable requirements, versus the Sunspec thing, which is all about testable, verifiable requirements. And so what's the question here? Have you, or what is your advice to us when we have a very noisy environment now, and with things changing so quickly, we have federal government documents written that say, hey, we recommended that you take a really strong look at this 15.7.3 thing, and then you got groups like Sunspec saying, well, that's fine, but there's no way that you could actually assess a system at this point for compliance to that. So we want to do this really simple thing. So as we're introducing cybersecurity practices, how do we deal with the ambient noise?
Well, it's a competition. I mean, it's like various technical approaches. Forget about the standards. The market is going to decide on one or the other, and sometimes it's not the best solution. So you're right. I'm not familiar with that. I have no idea what kind of mind share it has, or what percentage of the market is endorsing it or following it. Certainly, if it had the mind share and was the direction, and you wanted to build a certification program for Sunspec, you'd want to harmonize with it. If it's not, and you think you can move yours faster, then right. I would say I would tell them to do a crosswalk to your thing. And so I think at this point, unless I'm mistaken, I think it's still a wide open market, and
it is. Yeah.
And it's who's going to have the most compelling argument, and it's as much about the business model as it is about the security.
Okay, well thanks. Because what our approach was, we started off with this 1547.3 document and to source requirements out of it, and we did cherry pick a few requirements that were not as well written, not as tight of requirements as we'd like, but we took the basic idea, about 6 or 7 of them versus the hundreds that were in there, and we said, okay, this is what we're going to do for our program.
I mean, for me, I'm always, I don't do much consulting anymore. It was my main line of business for about 15 years till the show got so big that I had to either give it up or focus on it. But I do some, but all the time when I'm consulting, I'm looking for early wins and efficient risk reduction. Where am I going to get the most risk reduction for my next dollar or hour I spent? And so my personal bent is more towards the Sunspec approach, as opposed to creating this perfect document that everyone agrees will cover every circumstance. So that's what I like better. Now, the industry doesn't always agree with that. Sometimes the other way works, but I worry sometimes if you're doing something very complex, how long is it going to take to push it out? And if I was going to worry about harmonization, I would be looking for anything that conflicted with 1547.3. So if what you're doing in Sunspec is helping to meet 1547.3 but is not complete, I wouldn't worry. But if you were going in a different direction, then I might sit down and say, are we really confident this is the right direction?
Well, you're welcome back every month. Thank you. Appreciate that. Go back to you, Jay.
All right. Well, I think we've hit on the requirements and certification a lot.
Can we hit on? I see Jay has. Oh, that's you. Secure development life cycle isn't likely. When you talk about SDL and you mentioned Patch Act, can I go on a little riff
please.
about that? Because I've been thinking about that, and it's funny. I was very anti-Patch Act until I did a podcast with Josh Corman, who I'm the Cavalry. He was on the COVID task force, U.S. COVID task force. Now he's with Clarity. And I was against the Patch Act because the Patch Act required an SBOM, a software bill of materials, and it required some vulnerability management, disclosure, and things, none of which was bad, but it really wasn't going to make much of a difference. I still believe this. I don't think it was going to affect medical devices in the next 1 to 3 years or even 1 to 5 years. It's not, the problem isn't that these devices don't have an SBOM, for example. It's the they have many other things that are holding them back. But there is something, whether it be a secure development lifecycle requirement or an SBOM requirement on the vendor, that starts them down the path where we want to go. And we saw this with PLCs in traditional ICS. 2004, 2005, people said we need authentication in these PLCs. We need some basic encryption, a lot like what's in the Sunspec device requirements. We said we need these things, and people said, oh, it'll take decades. And then a decade later, hadn't started, and it would be, oh, it will take decades. And I think to a certain degree, not because it's going to immediately benefit the end user, but if we can get the people making these devices to start to do these sorts of things, to track what's going into their products through an SBOM, to have a vulnerability handling capability, if we can start to get that in there, it's going to pay dividends in 8 to 10 years. So I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of pushing down. In this case, like the 62443 SDL, I think could be very applicable to the device manufacturers, but less so for the consumers.
Sure. So it's more to change the corporate mindset, or at least get them to pay attention to these things. And while the end product isn't the thing that actually bumps up your security, just having the company aware of these things and start to track it gives you that benefit.
Well, and also gets them, it will help the company, because the ones that are not tracking what's in their product carefully are creating all this technical debt that they're constantly having to deal with. So we've seen this. You can just look at the history of the DevOps world, and you see that following some of these practices has helped the companies as much as the end product. It's helped them save money. Their development becomes much more efficient. It's just hard to make that jump to doing these things that you've never done before, because there's an initial upfront cost. So the Patch Act is going to, in the medical sector, is going to force the vendors to do this, which will put them on a better footing, which will eventually help the customer.
Yeah, that's great. All right, well, I'd like to shift gears here a little bit. So this is something I've been thinking about recently. There was a vulnerability discovered in a large US DER manufacturer's product. They were alerted to this issue by CISA, and they chose not to respond, and it was published. And I was kind of shocked by this. And I guess my question to you is, if there are no repercussions of any kind, or at least the companies seem to think that, for having insecure devices and not fixing their products when there are issues, how do we change their mindset? How do we prove to them that this is critically important? And so I don't know. I'm just kind of shocked by this story and want to get your perspective. Have you seen other industries have this mentality where they just don't care?
What were you shocked by? The
fact
that they didn't fix it?
The coordinated vulnerability disclosure process.
Or that they wouldn't fix it? Which one? Or both?
More the PR side of things, I guess, unfortunately. That it didn't look good, right? That they basically were informed of an issue and they didn't address it. The clock ran out and it was published. So that was the part that surprised me. I guess the other part of it is just the urgency from some of these organizations to fix issues. And I have personally reported problems to companies, and they say, well, our our next update cycle is 3 months. Can you give us enough time to do this? It's like there's no motivation to fix things urgently if there are security holes in these products. So I'm curious, just how do you change people's attitude?
Well, again, I'm not a developer, but I have talked to numerous ones that I respect. And some of the times when vulnerabilities are found, changing them is not something that can happen in 3 months. I mean, sometimes it is so deep in there and is so connected to various parts that if you were to do it that much, you would be doing shoddy engineering and shoddy development and probably causing more problems than you're fixing.
Sure.
So
in this case,
that's where it gets tough.
In this case, it was 1 line of code and I pointed it out. So
yeah. So in that case, I think you're right. But to me, this is what, and again, I sound like a Sunspec fanboy. I should find more things I don't like, so I don't sound so much like a fanboy. But the fact that one of the Sunspec requirements was the ability to upload new firmware in a secure manner to a device, that was one of the key requirements, to me helps address this. Now, if you're looking at devices that are deployed now, I don't know their profiles. I don't know how many can do this in a secure way. And I don't know what the agreements are in terms of, I saw in the spec too, that the default was to allow the upload. You had to actually specifically opt out of that as opposed to opt in to that. And I think once you get that sort of thing, then you can be pushing more on these vendors to be doing this. And that was another feature of the Patch Act, that they had to have a vulnerability process to bring it in and to fix vulnerabilities in medical devices. So that's where I actually think the future for these types of devices is much better than medical, because medical devices, it's a little more dangerous to auto update them. You don't know what's happening. You can't do that. But these devices, especially with the agreements in place, if you can auto update them, to me, it's a solvable problem. So I'm not surprised you saw it. I don't think most customers care about it. So again, I think it has to be something that gets spec'd into the product and required by either large installers or utilities. And then you get past that problem.
Well, I have a little bit different take on this scenario, and that is, I mean, to quote you, it's a market issue, right? I mean, if the stock market, for example, valued a company's ability to stay on top of patching its products for whatever reason, then I think you'd see a different behavior on behalf of the vendor, right? Their stock gets punished. Yeah, they're going to go fix that line of code and tell everybody about it. So I got to believe there's precedents in other industries where you've seen sort of a similar reticence because, hey, the market leader doesn't want to rock the boat. And so therefore they just stay mum about it and continue on their way.
Yeah, you really have to look at, I think you're right, Tom. You really have to look at the market. There was a case in around the 2010 to 2012 timeframe where a large PLC manufacturer made a requirement to change the default password when you started up their product. Sounds good, right? You want to get rid of default passwords. The best way to do it is the thing turns on, you get a screen that pops up, and you have to enter new credentials.
Right.
Well, as soon as they did that, their support calls went through the roof because people didn't write down or remember the password. Their customers were angry. Someone said, I'm locked out of my system. I'm never going to buy your product again. And the security team got chewed out by the executives and said, we're not doing any more security. The market spoke. Right. It was done in a way that they didn't like. I'm not sure that you're going to see a lot of consumer push for this kind of thing. I keep pointing back at the utilities. The way that the consumer would work, and I was a little bit encouraged by it. Consumer Reports was getting into this area, and Consumer Reports was going to put something. So I could see if you had an organization like Consumer Reports do a study on, inverters, and they said these are the ones we recommend for these reasons. We don't recommend these, and either this 1547.3 or Sunspec could be one of those things on their list. Maybe that would have some impact on the consumer. But you're right. It's all about, we've seen this so often that things happen and the market shrugs its shoulders, and it's hard to tell the product vendor this is critical because they're seeing no impact to their bottom line.
Yeah, and of course sometimes these big market players, they end up regretting it because something untoward happens and now they got a crisis on their hands. But yeah, but you're right. It's a very tough calculation to make, because even though as you said, making a certain fix may sound good, but your customers may in fact hate it. So you have to deal with that.
But I wonder a little bit with this, especially now, I don't know as much about the business. So down here in Maui, for example, Costco has, it's hot down here, so they have these coverings over the parking spots, and they put solar on all of those. So we have a lot of businesses putting substantial amount of solar there, and maybe they're more an active participant in the setup and configuration. Although I'm a little skeptical about that. I think they just let it run, and as long as things are working, they're happy. But the average consumer, I know more about my system than the average consumer does. And
sure.
And when you start to go in and say, what software version are you running or anything like that, I'm like, I have no idea. I have no idea when any of that stuff happens. And quite frankly, I really don't want to know.
Yeah. I don't think it's in the industry's interest to make people need to know that stuff, right?
Yeah.
You don't ask that about the other consumer services or products that you interact with. Well, unless
right. Right.
Yeah, question came in here from Khalid Ansari at FM Approvals, and he's talking about the U.S. National Cyber Strategy and its objective to shift liability for insecure products. A little bit more on this. I know you have looked pretty in depth at some of the cyber insurance space, and I'm curious. I guess I haven't thought about this a whole lot, but liability here and who gets assigned blame for certain things, and it seems to always fall back on the utilities if something goes wrong with the power grid, even if it's, ultimately the DER vendor or customer's fault, whatever that means, for doing something or configuring things insecure, etc. So do you have any thoughts on this, again, non-federated environment, and how responsibility should be divvied up, or how, if you wanted to do cyber insurance for the DER ecosystem, how that might play out?
Well, I think the shift left for the liability is different than the cyber insurance. I think those are two very different issues. And I think that came in the U.S., as Khalid said, that was in the U.S. National Cyber Strategy. They've talked a lot about that. It sounds really good. I think we have to wait to see how that actually happens. I'm much more skeptical that actually would happen in a court of law, because we tell people you need defense in depth, right? You shouldn't, one flaw should not cause your whole system to fall apart. You could go to the end user who might want to take a legal action against a company, and you have to say, well, what did you do? Did you follow all these good practices? And you start to, who's responsible, I think, is much less clear. I think the case law on that is going to be interesting. It's not a bad effort to go down, but I think we're a long time before you see any of that. And I think it's going to be a lot of interesting case law if it even goes down that far. I'm skeptical we'll even get to the point where these cases come to court, but we'll see. And I guess I'm not sure on your insurance question. What are you specifically asking about?
I'm not sure what I'm asking either. I guess, well, if you're a DER manufacturer and you are selling millions of products into the U.S. market, and you purchased cyber insurance for your operational OT networks and your systems, and there is something that occurs there that takes down the power system, for instance, is it the utility's responsibility? Is it the DER vendor's responsibility? Will the cyber insurance have to pick up that cost? I guess there's a lot of finger pointing in this industry about who's responsible for what. And that's one of the big things that we pointed out in a hopefully forthcoming report to Congress, where it's like, basically, the people in control of the systems and the networks are not the same people being assigned the responsibility for keeping the system operational. And that's very different than almost all other industries.
Well, the good news is the insurance companies, the insurance industry has worked through much more difficult issues than this. You know, a lot of times people are very skeptical about cyber insurance, and then I talk to the insurance people and you start to hear about the history of what they've done and how they've gone through creating new products, new insurance products, going all the way back to the Barbary pirates. You could get pirate insurance, you know, and it's like, well, there were no pirates before and they created this. They didn't have the data. They have a way of working through this, and it's a much more up and down profit and loss environment in the early years, but eventually they lock into it. And so I think they will solve this problem, and you will see insurance for both. You'll see insurance for the vendors that you talked about, whether they're just providing the products or also some services, and you'll see insurance for the utilities. I don't think that's necessarily going to be a big surprise. And then just like you see in other insurance cases or other cases of loss, I guess, that lead to insurance, is let's say the utility is hit, you may file a claim against your insurance company. Your insurance company may file a claim against the vendor. You know, so we see these things, and it's just people get nervous because it's not all worked out yet, but we're going through that process of working it out. And as dark and as gloomy as the ransomware appeared to make cyber insurance appear, they actually are doing pretty well. They have made a lot of money on cyber insurance. They have 1 or 2 years where they probably broke even, which they don't like to do, but they make money on your policies. And then they also make money on the return on the assets they keep from your policy. So they make money on their investments, their interest and such, and on the policy dollars. So they're doing okay. They love the market. They're going to figure it out.
Hey, we're nearing the top of the hour, so I want to ask you a question. Some would say it would be about today, but about the future, and that's about the role of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity and operational technology. And so you can deal with that topic, or basically in summation. Again, you've heard about our concerns here today. We're preparing. We're addressing the needs of today, but we like to prepare for tomorrow. So what are your thoughts on that topic, artificial intelligence and other technical influences on cybersecurity going to the future?
Well, for a number of years, I've believed that this, and it's been available for a long time, the machine learning based on digital twins and other models are going to provide us with process variable anomaly detection. That is going to be kind of the holy grail of detecting things going wrong, whether they be induced by an adversary or something else. We've seen GE had Digital Ghost was an example of this. We've seen numerous presentations at S4 going on for years. It's been slow to be adopted, but once you have the digital twins or the models, to me, this is a no-brainer. You've got all the data. You just look for some correlations and you do it. So that's kind of the standard one. The newer one that, everyone's talking about, these AI large language models, it's been so popular in recent years. I guess I don't have a good answer probably to your direct question, but I have a big fear that it is reinforcing unproven mantras in our industry. That I have this big problem that we are saying we need to do all these things. These are good practices. These are very important. And we have little evidence they're actually doing anything to address risk. And now all these people singing in this harmonic chorus are going to be reinforced by these large language models, and we're going to get stuck down this road. It's almost, I say it's the equivalent of, remember when we were saying forcing users to frequently change passwords was a good thing. You know, that got so ingrained, and no one really looked at whether it was actually helping or not. I'm worried we're going to do that, but I'm sure there's a lot of other elements that other people can come up with, but those are the two I look at.
All right, very good. Well, we are at the top of the hour, folks. And so with that, I want to thank Dale again for his presence here and for kindly addressing our audience. Dale, we certainly appreciate your remarks from a Sunspec perspective, but even more so your knowledge and your wisdom in this field. And so with that, I encourage you all to check out Dale's company, S4 Events. And if you do get a chance to attend his conference, it's well worth it. You'll like it a lot. I believe Jay's maybe is going to be there this year. But nonetheless, it's a great forum, and as an industry, I think we can learn a lot because we're in the business of growing up very fast here. So it's all the more reason to be looking at those that have done it before. So with that, thank you again, Dale, and thanks to our audience.